chapter 8, and I'm probably only going to read about half of chapter 8 since it's rather long, so I will let you know where I leave off. This chapter aims to sharpen your sense of the ethical dimension of teaching and your understanding of the legal underpinnings of many aspects of school life. We examine several common ethical problems faced by teachers, along with legal issues and recent court rulings that have affected them. If each of us were the only person on the face of the earth, we could behave exactly as we choose. We would not have to worry about the rights or feelings of anyone else. We would be free of the constraints and demands imposed by others as we went about doing our own will. Of course, this is simply not the case. Everyone who walks on earth is bound by real, if unforeseen, connections with his or her fellow humans. The English poet John Donne said it most succinctly. No man is an island. Our system of ethics and laws are a major part of these invisible connecting fibers. Together they make civilized society in a neighborhood and coexistence on a planet possible. Ethics, as we say in chapter 9, what are the philosophical foundations of American education, brings us into the realm of what is the right way to act. Ethic refers to a system or a code of morality embraced by a particular person or group. Laws related to but different from ethics. An individual law is a written rule that members of a given community must follow. The law is a system of such rules that governs the general conduct of a particular community's citizens. Whereas ethics may be invisible obligations that we perceive, laws typically are statements that have been harmed out by the legitimate authority of a particular community, state, or nation, and are used in court as standards by which to judge and often penalize the actual behavior of individuals. What someone might refer to as an unstated law, it is not a law at all. However, it is an ethical statement. Laws are concrete, made by people, and usually written down for the public to see. Ethics, by contrast, consist of ideas that are less tangible and observable. Most of our laws are simply the codification of what we see as our moral or ethical obligations to one another. For example, we have laws against excessive speeding that follow our ethical beliefs that we ought not endanger the lives of others. Sometimes, however, laws are unethical, such as the racial segregation laws that existed in this country a mere half-century ago. Also, ethical obligations may not always be codified as laws, such as the ethical obligation to help the weak, the poor, and the sick. What does all this have to do with teachers? First, it is the responsibility of teachers to convey to the young the fundamental moral message that we are all legally and ethically bound to one another. Much of this moral message is incorporated into the content of our curricula, from our great stories to our history as people. Second, as we explore this chapter, a school is awash with ethical and legal issues. A unique set of ethical relationships and legal obligations is embedded in teachers' work. As a consequence, teachers carry a special ethical and legal burden. This second issue is the subject of this chapter. At the heart of the teacher's unique ethical and legal relationship with students is power. Like it or not, power resides in the office of teacher. Compared with a corporate executive or a military officer, it may not appear that a teacher has a great deal of power. In reality, teachers have a special type of power. This power arises from the fact that teachers have an impact on people when they are still at a very malleable stage. Teachers are legally in command of a classroom insofar as they have the responsibility of what goes on. Teachers evaluate their students. They not only mark them with tangible symbols that become part of students' official records, but they also mark their minds and hearts. Many careers are open to you, but few offer such truly awe-inspiring power. Because of the potential for abuse of this power, codes of ethics have been established to guide teachers, and a body of laws govern the work of teaching. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. We therefore urge you to take the material in this chapter quite seriously. Being an ethical teacher means having a special relationship with your students and the other people with whom you work. Consider the following case as told to educator Kenneth Howe by a participating teacher. Marilyn Henderson is a 5th grade language arts teacher at Willoughby Elementary in South Lake, a medium-sized city with a population of roughly 150,000. Maryland is troubled to learn that Connie Severns, a 5th grade social studies teacher with whom Marilyn worked previously at another school in the South Lake system, will be transferred to Willoughby. Marilyn believes Connie to be incompetent and is uncomfortable with this knowledge, especially in light of the fact that her students will be moving through Connie's class. As Marilyn recalls, Connie didn't teach anything. She couldn't teach anything. Others in the district share Marilyn's assessment of Connie as a teacher, and apparently with good reason. Connie seems totally to lack control. Children cry and complain about the chaos. Some steal things from her purse, and on one occasion, another teacher discovered a child chasing Connie around the room. Marilyn had previously tried to do something about Connie's incompetence, but met with little success. The teachers' union advised her that they would have to stand behind a tenured teacher, and the school administration claimed to have to follow procedures that could take years, according to Marilyn. At this point in time, the principal of Willoughby called the affected teachers together. He, too, was concerned about Connie's transfer and proposed that they discreetly and surreptitiously write down things to build a case that they could use to have Connie fired. Marilyn is asked to be a part of this effort. This story provides just a peek into the teacher's ethically complex world. Howe suggests that in dealing with issues involving ethical judgment, we as teachers need to exhibit 6 characteristics: appreciation for moral deliberation, empathy, knowledge, reasoning, courage, and interpersonal skills. We need to see an ethical dilemma such as Marilyn's as a situation characterized by conflicting and competing moral interests. In this case, Connie's need for a job, the student's need for a competent teacher, and the other teachers' need to be fair in what they say to and about Connie. We must see the complex moral dimensions of the problem and appreciate that care must be taken to protect the rights of all parties. Empathy is the ability to mentally get inside the skin of another person. We need to feel what the others in an ethically troublesome situation are feeling. In the case described, we would need to empathize with everyone who is affected by the burden of a questionable teacher, the students and their parents, Connie and Marilyn, and the other teachers. One of the most valuable tools of a teacher who is able to deal effectively with ethical issues is knowledge. We must remember the facts that will enable us to put an issue in context. What does Connie actually do in the classroom? Which formal procedures are in place to deal with ineffective or incompetent teachers? In Marilyn's case, she has to be able to think clearly about the alternatives, such as participating in the principal's questionable plan or perhaps directly confronting Connie. And she must think through, with some degree of accuracy, what the likely consequences of such actions would be. Knowledge of the situation allows Marilyn to move to the next step, reasoning. To reason is to reflect systematically on an issue. When we reason about an issue, we move through it step by step and draw conclusions, or we compare a particular event or action with some moral principle and come to some conclusion. For instance, Marilyn may hold as moral principles the notions that people should not deceive others and that spying is deception. Through reasoning, she may come to the conclusion that what the principal has asked her to do is spying. Of course, this line of reasoning leaves Marilyn with another problem: how to tell her principal that his plan is unethical. To feel, to know, and to reason are not enough. To be ethical, we must act, and action sometimes takes courage. To be ethically correct often requires the willpower to act in what we perceive to be the right way, rather than in the comfortable way. Frequently, when confronted with a seemingly no-win dilemma like Marilyn's, we tend to ignore in the hope that it will simply go away. However, as the theologian Harvey Coates sees it, not to decide is to decide. Among other things, Marilyn must find a way to tell her principal that she simply cannot be part of his secret reporting network. Besides courage, this act will require tact. Besides courage, acting on ethical principles demand sensitivity. In addition, teachers need the communication skills to deal sensitively with issues that demand great tact. They have to be able to call up the right words with the right feeling and tone and address the issue at hand openly and honestly. Behind this 6-part process of dealing with ethical issues is something rather intangible, but nevertheless quite real: a personal code of ethics. Each of us has one, although some are beacons and others are dim lights in a dark room. For example, in Marilyn's response to our principal's request that she spy on Connie, what she does will be influenced by her personal code of ethics. That is, Marilyn's own answer to the question, what is the right thing to do here, is what will come into play. When individuals enter the classroom as teachers, they are not always able to act in a manner that they find most satisfying. For instance, a student's rude remark to you may cry out for a sarcastic comeback, and you may have the perfect one on the tip of your tongue. The actions of a student, even a very small child, may provoke a rush of anger. An athletic coach, a good friend, may ask you to raise the grade of one of your students who has become ineligible to play on the coach's team. Whatever you would like to do or what you might have done before as a civilian is of little importance in these situations. You must respond as a professional, as a teacher. You need to be ready to enact from a well-formed code of ethics. As mentioned earlier, ethics deals with the right thing to do. Everyone is expected to do the right thing, but teachers' responsibility and power ratchet up the demand for solid and sound ethical decisions on their part. In addition, teachers often must be able to make ethical decisions on the spot. Telling the athletic coach, "I'll think about it," won't do. Our personal answers to questions about what is the right thing to do represent our code of ethics. Unlike the formal code of ethics that govern doctors and established teachers' organizations, such as the National Education Association, our personal codes are not written down. Nevertheless, they are quite real and serve as our daily guide in moral matters large and small. Scholars often argue about whether humans are born with an imprinted sense of what is morally correct. Few would suggest that we were born with a full-blown guiding moral philosophy of life. Instead, developing a strong guiding code of ethics is one of our primary responsibilities as members of society. As part of this evolution, we can draw on a variety of sources, including human examples, spiritual and religious wisdom, secular guides, reason, and our moral compass. Humans are imitative creatures. First, we copy our parents and siblings, and then, as we move out into the world, we copy various people who cross our paths. Most of the important things we learn, such as language, physical skills, and ways to treat others, we learn from the example of others. Like Marilyn, when we are confronted with a "what should I do" question, the human examples we admire play a strong role in helping us come up with an ethically sound response. We recall the vision of a revered grandfather, parent, or friend to guide us. What would Grandpa do in a situation like this? What would he expect me to do? Many people regularly rely on the examples set by people they have never met, such as individuals from history or literature. For example, some people wear WWJD bracelets standing for "What would Jesus do?" The bracelets are meant to be a regular reminder of how to respond to ethical situations. Others draw on the examples of staunchly moral Americans such as George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and Eleanor Roosevelt. This is one reason why these figures are studied in our schools. Also, parents want their children to be taught by ethical people because they want their children to be influenced by good examples. Conversely, attentive parents often shield their children from bad companions and violent TV and movie characters out of concern that their children will acquire those behaviors. For many people, one of the primary sources of ethical guidance is the spiritual and religious domain. Sacred books such as the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran are rich in moral precepts and stories. Some of this ethical guidance is quite direct and pointed. For instance, the Old Testament's 10 Commandments are hardly the 10 suggestions for Christians and Jews, and the 8 Beatitudes of the New Testament are not simply a collection of nice ideas. Instead, these precepts are meant to be strong guides to practice and to become life habits. The ethical precepts of many other traditions serve much the same role. A large part of our ethical guidance comes from everyday life. A parent regularly repeats an aphorism such as "a stitch in time saves 9. We see a Nike commercial that urges us to just do it. At a red light, we read a bumper sticker imploring us to question authority. These everyday adages and maxims are great guides to behavior. Many, in turn, are richly ethical, such as the message conveyed by the bumper sticker: perform random acts of kindness. In recent years, there has been an explosion of self-help books on topics ranging from how to succeed in business to how to be a good spouse. Much of this content is intended to provide ethical guidance to readers. For instance, raise good children, that is, children who will be considerate of others and know right from wrong. In reality, these books are helping parents instill a code of ethics into their children. As we discuss in Chapter 9, what are the philosophical foundations of education, ethics is a branch of the discipline of philosophy that aids us intellectually to examine issues of right and wrong. Throughout the use of our reasoning abilities, we can sort out whether an issue has an ethical component and think through the consequences of various courses of action. In the case of Marilyn, she can think through what might happen as she decides to help the principal build a case against her colleague, Connie. A significant aspect of being a reflective practitioner, as we urge throughout this book, is the capacity to bring reason to bear on the ethical issues you confront as a teacher. The factors that contribute to our personal codes of ethics do not operate in isolation from one another. Ideally, they work together to help us sort out a problem and act properly. As occurs with acquiring a good golf swing or achieving fluency in a foreign language, many small elements come together in a smooth, coordinated way. With our personal code of ethics, each factor contributes to our moral compass, the ethical mental magnet that quickly enlightens us about what we ought to do. The four elements that make up our code of ethics provide us with a moral North Pole. Someone with a strong moral compass doesn't have to tell the athletic coach that he or she will get back to him. Instead, the teacher immediately rejects the proposal. When the principal makes an unethical request or the teacher sees a favorite student cheating, the teacher knows immediately what he or she must do. Again, as with golf or speaking a foreign language, the skillful application of a code of ethics takes practice. Throughout this book, we have sprinkled many teaching cases that are explicitly ethical in nature or have an ethical component. We urge you to take these opportunities to practice sharpening your ability to apply your personal code of ethics to professional situations. As you read each case, take time to reflect carefully on it. Keep in mind the 6 characteristics described by Kenneth Howe. Also, bring your own moral compass to bear on the cases. Discuss them with other people. We often see much more in a situation involving ethics and recognize many other possible courses of action once we have talked to other people about it. Recently, drugs have plagued your community, and increasingly they are coming into the schools. You are a 6th grade teacher, and there has been only sporadic evidence of drugs in your building. Your principal has been making what seems to you a big deal out of very little in his crusade to stamp out drugs in his school. He has threatened the student body, 1st graders to 6th graders, in a special assembly about what will happen to them if they are caught with drugs of any kind. Most of your in-service training time this year has been taken up with the subject of drugs. You are concerned about the misuse of drugs in our society, but like most of the other teachers, you find the principal's preoccupation with drugs overzealous and slightly laughable. You are afraid of what will happen to the first offender he catches. Coming from lunch, you see Alan, one of your 6th graders, showing 2 of his friends a plastic bag containing what appears to be 3 or 4 marijuana joints. You are startled but unsure that you have actually seen what he has. Alan shoves the bag into his pants pocket, and you act as if nothing has happened and usher the boys into class. To gain time to think, you set the students to work on a composition. Alan is a kid with a spotty record in the school. His family life is rumored to be rather chaotic, but he has behaved well in your class. You have never seen the slightest evidence that he has ever been high in school. Knowing Alan, you guess he got the dope from one of his brothers and brought it to school to impress his friends, but you could be wrong, and the situation could be much more serious. You are sure of one thing: if you report what you saw to the principal, as you are expected to do, he will move in on Alan like a crazed SWAT team. As you mull over this, Alan and his friends are nervously watching you and anxiously looking back and forth to one another. Suddenly, Alan gets up, comes to your desk, and asks if he can go to the boys' room. What do? Donald Mitchell is a veteran history teacher in your high school, and he has ruled the roost in the department for the past 15 years. Many current and former advanced placement and honor students adore him. They find him exceedingly challenging, and they claim that his teaching prepares them for the rigors of college. Apart from his senior AP classes, Mr. Mitchell teaches 2 sections of American government to 10th grade students. A number of the students in those 2 classes have IEPs. Mr. Mitchell publicly claims skepticism about many of these students' learning disabilities, doing only grudgingly what he has to do to comply with the IEPs. You have often heard Mr. Mitchell complain about lowering standards of educational excellence when he sits with his cronies in the school lunchroom. He does not hesitate to announce to the others about what he sees as being wrong with the school administration and the student body, and on occasion even faculty from other departments. His latest pet peeve is the laxness with which the English department teaches writing, so he has designed a strict procedure for writing in his history papers. You have often found Mr. Mitchell to be boorish, but you reason that his behavior and opinions are his own prerogative. After all, you think to yourself, his teaching approaches are really a matter of academic freedom. One afternoon, one of your students come to class visibly upset. Janelle is one of your more challenging students. She has had a few minor run-ins with the vice principal, and she does not demonstrate much interest in academics. You often have been frustrated by what you see as Janelle's lack of motivation and effort. Privately, you ask her what is wrong. She tells you that she has just left Mr. Mitchell's class, where she received a paper that was given a D-. She listened to her, reluctant to talk about the grading policies of another teacher. After calming down, Janelle tells you that it wasn't the grade itself that made her so upset, but how the teacher returned the paper. She claims that Mr. Mitchell stood up at the front of the class, stating that some of the students' papers followed the proper format. Others, he sneered, were so riddled with errors and poorly written that the only use for them would be to line a kitty litter bin. He added that he designed his format so that some students would learn to write correctly, but that many of them apparently could not or would not even follow his simple format. With that statement, he scattered those papers on the floor. He passed the satisfactory papers to the rest of the students. When the rest of the students, all inclusion students, were left without their papers, he glanced at them and said, "Well, go on. They're right there if you want them." And he pointed to the floor. Janelle tells you that she waited until class was dismissed to pick up her paper from the floor. You excused Janelle so you can go to the girls' room, and then you ask to speak to another student who was in the same class. When you ask him again privately if anything unusual happened in history class, the student replies, "It was a regular class." You're still curious, so you ask him how Mr. Mitchell returned the papers. The student looks at you quizzically and says, "How'd he return the papers?" "The same way you do. He walked around the room and handed them back to us." You're very disturbed by the story Janelle told you, and you want to do something to intervene, yet the other student's report makes you hesitant. What if nothing unusual did occur? Make an enemy of Mr. Mitchell would not be the politically savvy thing to do, and Janelle can certainly be difficult at times. Maybe she was just angry at the teacher for some reason and wanted to cause trouble. But what if that story were true? What should you do? As we hope the preceding case studies make clear serious ethical issues strongly influence the lives of teachers, few teachers get very far into their careers without having to deal with ethical dilemmas like these. Of course, these cases hardly exhaust the ethical responsibility of teachers. A much larger area of ethical responsibility exists that we call the everyday ethics of teaching. Although it is clear that parents have the primary responsibility for the ethical training of our children, schools do influence the character and moral lives of students. Classrooms and schoolyards abound with issues of right and wrong. A student submits a report that is downloaded from an internet site. Two girls start a rumor that another girl is pregnant. A group of boys send lewd material to a girl's Facebook page. A teacher continually and harshly picks on the same student. Events like these send strong ethical messages to students. In particular, teachers ethically influence students in three ways: by their personal example, by the classroom climate they create, and by the dialogue they establish. First, teachers can set a good personal example. An old adage states that who you are speaks louder than what you say. The way in which teachers do their work, the care and seriousness of their teaching, and the manner in which they treat students are perhaps their most powerful ethical messages to students. Second, teachers can establish a beneficial classroom climate by creating an environment for safety and trust where students are free from fear and ridicule, where a spirit of cooperation and friendly competition prevails, and where students are working hard and feeling the satisfaction of learning. Third, teachers can establish an ethical dialogue in their classroom by discussing with students the core ethical values such as honesty, respect for others, and responsibility that come into play not only in the study of literature and history, but especially in the real-life events of the school. The everyday ethics of teaching then means doing the job as it ought to be done. It means realizing the preciousness of the minutes and hours that you spend with students and making sure they do not waste their time with you. Teachers do not struggle alone when they face ethical issues. Besides their own understanding, reasoning, and moral compass, they have the support of a professional group. Professional groups, such as those composed of doctors, architects, and teachers, have special obligations to their clients. Whereas some entire professions have formulated their own universal code of ethics, there is no single universally accepted code of ethics for teachers. Nevertheless, several codes of ethics for teachers have been published. The best known is the Code of the National Education Association. In recent years, a number of state departments of education, such as those in Texas, California, and Alaska, have also developed codes of ethics to govern the work of their teachers. Alaska's Code of Ethics of Teaching Standards is particularly explicit, with entries such as teachers may not expose a student to unnecessary embarrassment or disparagement. Teachers may not use professional relationships with students for private advantage or gain. Teachers may not interfere with a colleague's exercise of political or citizenship rights and responsibilities. Also, a number of teacher preparation programs have instituted a code of ethics for student teachers as they begin this intense field experience. Among them are teacher preparation programs at Northern Illinois University and Boston University. The Boston University Educator's Affirmation is taken voluntarily in a special and quite popular ceremony, usually right before student teaching, run by the education students. The ritual marks their commitment to the high ideals and standards of the profession. In this sense, this affirmation is similar to the Hippocratic Oath that physicians take. I dedicate myself to the life of an educator, to laying the living foundations upon which successor generations must continue to build their lives. I dedicate myself to the advancement of learning, for I know that without it our successors will lack both the vision and the power to build well. I dedicate myself to the cultivation of character, for I know that humanity cannot flourish without courage, compassion, honesty, and trust. I dedicate myself to the advancement of my own learning and to the cultivation of my own character, for I know that I must bear witness in my own life to the ideals that I have dedicated myself to promote in others. In the presence of this gathering, I bind myself to this affirmation. Once upon a time, teachers were like the kings and queens of small kingdoms. Their authority was wide and their decisions were rarely questioned. Students who would not or could not do the work were held back or told not to come back. Students who did not conform to the teacher's standards of behavior were expelled. Education was something of a scarce commodity, and students and their parents tended to view education as a special opportunity that put definite responsibilities on the student's shoulders. In fact, much of the legal authority of teachers was based on the principle of in loco parentis, meaning in the place of parents. In other words, it was generally agreed that teachers acted as parental figures while students were in their care. For that reason, teachers' leeway in treating students fairly broad, and they could make decisions about students based on what they believed was in the best interest of the student or students. In the last few decades, however, the attitude toward schooling in the United States has changed. The authority of the adults in general and of teachers in particular has eroded noticeably, and many students are often more fixated on their rights than on their responsibilities. Many reasons for this change exist, but suffice it to say that today are very litigious society. The United States has more lawyers per capita than any other nation in the world, and our increasing tendency to use the courts to settle differences and conflicts has had its impact on the work of teachers. Our elementary and secondary schools have always been governed by school law. In recent years, however, the presence of the law in educational matters has grown dramatically. Like many societal changes, this trend has been a mixed bag. On the one hand, teachers are often cautioned to remember that students are autonomous with individual rights that continue to exist even when students pass through schoolhouse doors and are under the supervisions of teachers. As a result, teachers are required to be much more deliberate and cautious in their dealings with students to prevent the infringement of students' rights than they were in earlier decades. On the other hand, our new consciousness of the teachers' legal responsibilities and our heightened sense of students' rights have helped schools eliminate problems such as dictatorial practices by teachers and administrators, the thoughtless denial of certain rights to students, and the abusive use of corporal punishment. Woodrow Wilson once said, "The law that will work is merely the summing up in legislative form of the moral judgment that the community has already reached." In other words, our laws represent our collective social judgments and decisions about what is fair and what is the right thing to do. Laws differ from codes of ethics, though, because they apply to all people, not to a particular group, like doctors or teachers. Laws are public, whereas ethics can reflect one's private standards, and laws have judicial teeth, whereas code of ethics do not. Rarely is a teacher suspended or expelled or even sanctioned by the teaching profession for violating some code of ethics. Conversely, teachers are regularly affected by the law and occasionally brought to court. The next sections examine some specific areas of law that can affect your work as a teacher. One other issue complicates the legal front for teachers. The laws governing schools are part of a complex and overlapping system of federal, state, and local laws. Most of the cases discussed in this chapter started out as local school district disputes, only to travel to state courts, then to federal courts, and some finally to U.S. Supreme Court. Some caused the Supreme Court to reinterpret past rulings, leading to new legal guidelines. Because of their broad impact, the majority of the cases we deal with in this chapter are Supreme Court cases are a subset of the school law cases that deal directly with the work of teachers. School law, like many other facets of our society, is dynamic and open to change. Although the Supreme Court justices are supposed to dispassionately interpret cases in light of the U.S. Constitution, it is said that justices read the newspapers, meaning they are conscious of and sensitive to issues that are on people's minds, and this affects the cases they select to adjudicate. Therefore, cases involving contentious issues such as school choice are difficult for the court to avoid. A young junior high teacher on a lark changes his image. He comes to school one morning sporting a shaved head and a diamond stud earring. He is fired on Tuesday. A teacher gives a speech at a meeting of the local LGBT Alliance. The newspaper runs a story on the event, and the superintendent asks her to resign quietly. A business education teacher who has been teaching for 3 years has been visited by administrators only twice during that period. He loves teaching and was recently told by his principal that he was a shoo-in for tenure. Instead of getting the expected letter from the superintendent outlining the upcoming tenure review process, he receives a dismissal notice in May, claiming that his teaching is not up to the district standards. All three of these examples represent violations of teachers' rights to due process. Due process is one of the most important principles embedded in our nation's laws. The essential meaning of due process in education is that fairness should be rendered and teachers' rights as individuals should not be violated. Many of the first influential court decisions concerning education, teachers, and the law concern fundamental issues of due process. Due process protections come directly from 2 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The Fifth Amendment states, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The 14th Amendment adds, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The 14th law also goes on to stipulate that no person should be denied the equal protection of the law. Legal rulings related to due process in education often reflect the requirement that individuals be treated equally in their education or by school officials. When judging the fairness of an action, there are 2 due process concerns. Substantive due process has to do with the issue itself. Procedural due process concerns the fairness of the process followed. For example, if a teacher is fired because he wears a nose ring, it raises an issue of substantive due process. In this manner, substantive is enough in this particular circumstance to deny a teacher employment. What is a fair decision in this matter? Procedural due process would involve how the case is handled. Suppose the teacher, after hearing several rumors that the nose ring is irking, the superintendent gets a curt letter saying his services are no longer needed. Is this process fair? Has the teacher had a fair chance to defend himself? The precise meaning of procedural due process varies from state to state, but the Supreme Court decisions in Goldberg v. Kelly indicate that the minimum procedural safeguards demanded by rudimentary due process would include the following. Procedural safeguards: the opportunity to be heard at a reasonable time and place, timely and adequate notice giving details of the reason for and the proposed suspension or dismissal, an effective opportunity to defend oneself, including oral presentation of evidence and arguments, an opportunity to confront and cross-examine witnesses, the right to retain an attorney, a decision resting solely on the legal rules and evidence adduced at the hearing, a statement of the reasons for the determination and the evidence relied on, and an impartial decision maker. Procedural due process exists so that the individual teachers and students are protected from arbitrary actions against them. The principle of due process and these guidelines reach into many corners of a teacher's life, as will be discussed. Some of the most fundamental legal issues have to do with the legalities of employment. When, for instance, is a teacher actually hired? How does a teacher know he or she has an actual teaching position. What does having tenure really mean for a teacher? Teachers are not self-employed. They are employees of a school board, or in the case of a private school, a board of trustees. As employees of a governing body, teachers must be familiar with and abide by the stipulations of the contract issued to them by the school board. If teachers do not fulfill the requirements of the contract, they are at risk of losing their jobs. Imagine the following situation. You are a recent college graduate, newly licensed to teach, and you are actively interviewing for teaching positions. You're interviewed at the Long Meadow School District, goes extremely well, and the superintendent tells you she would like you to join the faculty. She says that she plans to recommend your hiring to the school board, telling you that for all intents and purposes you should consider that you have a teaching position because the board usually votes to approve the superintendent's recommendations. You tell her that you would like to join the faculty, accepting her verbal offer. Several weeks go by and you hear nothing from the school district. In the meantime, you are invited to the interview at the Centerville School District. When you interview there, you realize it is the ideal school district for you. The school administrators seem equally impressed with you, and in several days, the superintendent calls and offers you a position. It's your dream job. Although you want to accept immediately, you ask the superintendent for a day to think over the offer. In fact, what would you really want to do is find out your status at the Long Meadow School District. Do you really have a job there? If you accepted the offer at Centerville, you are violating some legal obligations to the Long Meadow School District. The answers to these questions depend on whether you have a legal contract for employment. A contract is a binding agreement between two or more people or parties. It indicates the rights and responsibilities of each party to the agreement, and all teachers, new and old, sign a contract with their Board of Education or trustees. Contracts differ from district to district and from state to state, but they generally specify the teacher's salary, course, teaching assignments, or instructional areas, the maximum class size, length of school day and school year, and grievance procedures. A grievance is the formal expression of a complaint about unsatisfactory working conditions. Grievances typically concern disputes over working conditions. When a person files a grievance, he or she usually argues that the working condition was in violation of the teacher's contract. Additionally, contracts generally indicate whether the local teachers association or union is the official bargaining agent for teachers. Contracts cover a set period of time. Most new teachers work on a contract that has to be renewed annually if the teacher is to stay employed by the school district. Even teachers on tenure sign a yearly contract stipulating the terms of employment. Occasionally, teachers may work under a continuing contract, which states that its terms will remain in force until the teacher is given notice that the contract will be terminated on a particular date. To be considered a legally enforceable document, a contract must do the following. Have a lawful subject matter, represent a meeting of the minds of both parties, include an exchange of something of value, to be entered into parties who are competent to do so, be written in proper form. In addition, the school board must act officially to ratify a teacher's contract. Many people assume that contracts must be written. In fact, unless state law requires a written contract, an oral contract that includes all legal requirements can also be legally binding. In the previously described scenario, unless all of the conditions were included in your discussion with the Long Meadow superintendent and the school board acted upon or ratified the superintendent's recommendation to hire you, you did not have a legally binding offer. Therefore, you could accept the Centerville offer without hesitation. Now, suppose that scenario were altered slightly. What if you had signed a contract with the Long Meadow School District and then accepted the Centerville offer? In that instance, you could be held liable for breach of contract. A legal contract is binding on both sides, that is, on both the school district and the teacher. If either party violates conditions of the contract itself is said to have been breached, and the other party can sue for damages. When an injured party successfully sues the other party for breach of contract, the court may order that the contract be fulfilled and that the injured party receive monetary damages or both. For instance, the district may have to rehire a fired teacher and pay damages, or a teacher who walks away from a job may have to pay the district's cost of finding a replacement. In addition, whenever a teacher breaches a contract, his or her professional reputation is in danger of being tarnished. Given these concerns, before you accept any position, you should study the contract carefully and ask about anything unclear to you. The contract will govern many of the important details of your life as a teacher. Imagine a few years have passed since you accepted the Carterville position. the Centerville position? At what point are you granted tenure? New teachers are hired on a probationary basis, with the probationary period often lasting 3 years, so the school district can ensure that a non-tenured teacher can teach well enough to be granted permanent faculty status. State law determines when a teacher is eligible for tenure and outlines the requirements